Hello, welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the in-house podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Aaron Wudrick, the director of MLI's domestic policy program. Very pleased you could join us today, and pleased to be joined by one of our very own senior fellow, Christian Leuprecht, who is also a professor at the Royal Military College and director of the Institute of Government Relations at Queen's University in Kingston. Christian, welcome.
Aaron, always a pleasure. Hello.
Now, I know today we're going to talk about a new piece that you've co-authored with Joseph Seaman entitled Coalition Strategic Cyber Campaigns, Functional Engagement as Cyber Doctrine for Middle Power Statecraft. It's a mouthful as a title. And I thought that maybe for our more layperson audience, you might want to start sort of big picture here to explain what you mean by cyber. I mean, this is a pretty broad word. What do you mean by cyber campaigns? And then maybe talk about why you decided to write a piece focusing on middle power countries in particular.
So those are all terrific points. And I'm glad you raised the point about cyber, because lots of people talk about it, but it's never really clear what most people mean when they talk about cyber. And sort of I make a crude distinction that technically is sort of suboptimal, but it works for the sake of explaining things between everybody's familiar with cybersecurity. But the way you think about this from a military and strategic perspective is as a domain. So the security piece is about the networks, it's about the data, it's about the hardware. The domain piece is about the effects that you are trying to achieve in that space. So that effect might be a ransomware attack, so that would be the cybersecurity piece, but the effect is that you're trying to extort money from someone. It might be a misinformation campaign, which might be a cybersecurity issue in terms of hacking someone's Twitter account or Facebook or whatever it might be. But the effect you're really trying to achieve is you're trying to influence a particular target audience. So this is why sort of countries tend to think about this as a strategic space and as an operational space. That yes, it has technical sides to it, but really it's about understanding what effects our adversaries trying to achieve. What effects are we trying to achieve? And the middle power point that you brought up is a very important from a Canadian perspective, because increasingly Canada has a difficult time competing in the world. So if you think about where we're at, we're back to great power competition, especially countries such as Russia or China that don't really take countries like Canada seriously. We're simply too small. They see that there's no particular risk or so emanating for their particular interests from Canada. And at the same time, we're contending with, on the one hand, large bilateral relationships such as Germany that can fend for itself, the European Union that groups together this host of countries that countries such as China and Russia have to contend with, because in particular of the economic power they bring to bear, which leaves countries such as Canada, Australia, but also to some extent, for instance, South Korea, a little bit sort of on their own and fending for their own. And so after World War II, anticipating that this might be a challenging international environment for countries such as Canada to compete in and assert their interests, Canada and Australia developed this concept of middle powers. That is to say, powers that have a vested interest in the international system, how the international system functions, and in the current state that have benefited disproportionately from what people conventionally call the liberal international rules-based order. And of course, as we know, there is no really such order. There's a few dozen countries that believe in that order. And then there's a significant number of countries led by China and Russia, but also North Korea and Iran, that do not believe in that order. And so it is increasing about what does Canada need to do in order to continue to assert not just its interests, but to prevail in that very competitive strategic environment, because anything that doesn't sustain the current international rules-based order will ultimately be to Canada's detriment in terms of political stability, in terms of our own prosperity, and in terms of broader social harmony. So we have a vested interest in investing in ensuring that order. That order, of course, has trade and physical components, but it also has cyberspace components that are less visible to most people.
Okay, well, I think you've done a good job of outlining why it's important to Canada. So I guess the question is, where does Canada sit right now with respect to a cyber doctrine or policy to direct inform its government's decisions on these things?
So there's two ways we can go about this. One is we can look at something called the Harvard Belfer Center's Cyber Power Index. In this index ranks a host of countries around the world on a whole series of capabilities and their ability to achieve certain types of effects. You might think, for instance, of North Korea, which is particularly good at extorting money through cyberspace. You might think of countries such as China that are looking to control the information space. So not everybody's looking to achieve the same types of effects. But that ranking is important because our key adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, rank in the top 10. Whereas Canada has now dropped out of the top 10 in that ranking with a tendency of a downward trend. That is a result of two phenomena. One is that other countries, in particular our adversaries, have invested heavily in that space, in cyberspace, in the cyber and cyber domain effects, because there's relatively asymmetric payoff for them. So with a relatively small investment, they can gain disproportionate payoff for the objectives that they're looking to achieve. Think of a relatively impoverished country such as North Korea, but yet there are disproportionate capabilities in cyberspace. So you can see that our allies are looking at a highly networked, highly prosperous, highly technology space in countries such as Canada, and they're going, maybe Canada needs to do a bit more of the heavy lifting and the burden sharing. So when we hear criticisms about Canada not doing enough, cyberspace is one of those. We have a very, very good, long-standing capabilities. But if you think about the Communication Security Establishment, Signals Intelligence Agency, relatively very high skilled but relatively limited capabilities, and not particularly cohesively integrated national security and intelligence community relative to, for instance, Australia and the and the UK, for instance. But you also look at, of course, countries such as the United States that bring disproportionate sort of firepower, if you will, in quotation marks, to cyberspace, that are looking at Canada and saying there's an opportunity for Canada to be a more serious player. And when the current government got elected in 2015, it recognized that. So if we look at Strong, Secure, Engage, our defense policy from 2017, there were two novel additions to that defense policy or defense policy update, and one of them was cyber and building out cyber capacity. But of course, we've recently seen that really that capacity has not come with at the pace that we would have expected, has not come with the personnel that we would have expected. We know the Canadian Armed Forces are facing serious personnel shortages. Those aren't limited to people in the infantry or to the health services. They also exist in particular in areas such as cyber, where it is a highly competitive marketplace. So it's difficult to compete. It's difficult to train up. These are very high skill sets. And it also hasn't come in terms of the doctrine, that is to say, if you want, the framework within which the military carries out its operations. And it also doesn't seem to have come in terms of the upranking of what Canada currently does in terms of a cyber command structure. Most of our allies have now recognized that the cyber domain requires its own command structure. The United States, many of our NATO allies that have now sort of emancipated, if you want, the command structure aside from, if you think of the maritime domain, the land domain, and the air domain, we've now recognized that cyber is a domain in and of itself. But we still don't have it emancipated as a full cyber command. So there's a number of areas where our allies are looking at Canada and saying, you need and can do more in terms of the way you posture your force, you resource your force, and the way you also make sure that you have the appropriate doctrine and you have the appropriate command structures in place so that Canada can optimize and maximize the relatively limited resources that it does bring to bear in this domain.
Okay. Well, I got a number of questions based on what you've just said there. And I mean, the first seems to be that, Canada, even amongst our allies, is seen as a bit of a weak link, if I can put it that way. So it's not just a question of Canada protecting our own interests, but ensuring that our allies have confidence that we are not a weak link, sort of in part of the sort of networked Western alliance, if I can put it that way. But my question too would be about Is it really a matter of just resources, Christian? I mean, this country is infamously underinvested in a number of things, including national defense generally. It's just a matter of political will and not wanting to devote the resources necessary to addressing cyber issues.
Well, the first thing you always need to do is you have to know, like, what are you going to use these resources for? So what's going to be the purpose of building out an operational capability? And this is why doctrine is so important, and why doctrine for Canada is so important. So the United States recognized in 2018 that cyberspace will require much more robust capability, and that in this space, you simply can't just play defense. As we all know, if you're simply playing defense, you're never going to score a goal. And you can see in the media on a daily basis that our adversaries are scoring regular goals on us. And so sometimes if you want to take out your adversary's offense, you need to be more active at actually interdicting that offense, or you might need to go on the offense yourself so that you can draw your adversary and their resources back. So if you think about this sort of as some pretty sort of simple sports strategy. And so the US recognized that playing defense wasn't really getting the results that it had been hoping for, and went to the most significant change perhaps in 25 years for US military posture with a cyber doctrine known as persistent engagement, which is that the US marshals its resources in the cyber domain on a persistent basis to push back against its adversaries, in particular with defensive, but also with active cyber operations. So an active cyber operation is where you might take out the adversary's capabilities and neutralize those capabilities, or an offensive capability where you might actually destroy network infrastructure, servers, data, whatever it might be. Now, the US can do this on a permanent, persistent basis because it has, I wouldn't say unlimited resources, but just has more resources in this domain than all of the other allies put together. So the question then is, the US isn't going to be doing Canada's bidding. And so what is Canada going to do? Well, Canada as a middle power still has key interests. We have interests in defending our sovereignty, our political interests. Canada has an interest in defending multilateral institutions. Think about NATO, think of the United Nations, institutions that it leverages disproportionately to assert its interests and to sustain the international rules-based order. And Canada has interests when it comes to its own prosperity, but also if you think about, for instance, shipping routes and the like. So Canada also, in the same way, has interests in cyberspace and sort of, for instance, pushing back against large-scale efforts by either states or state-tolerated groups or private sector groups when it comes to large ransomware attacks, when it comes to potential attacks on our critical infrastructure and so forth. And so the question is, first, we need to define what are the interests that we're looking to assert. And so I've just tried to lay those out. The nice thing is that these aren't just Canada's interests. These are the interests that other middle powers, conventional, traditional middle powers have as well. If you think of Australia, you think of countries such as the Netherlands. So there's a half dozen countries that sort of, think of Spain, that sort of fall into this, they're not small states, but they're also not sort of large enough to be able to do it on their own. And so the proposal here is something known as that we call in this paper functional engagement. We have a limited number of interests, but with those interests, we're going to draw red lines. Now, why is it important to draw red lines? You might say, look, Aaron, why don't you just go down to the UN and you just negotiate some treaty where we all sign on and we're all going to agree, just like the way we say, we're going to protect certain types of infrastructure in wartime. Why don't we just kind of say, like, here's our treaty of how we're all going to behave in cyber domain and cyberspace? Well, we've been trying that for 25 years and it's gotten us nowhere. Why has it not gotten us anywhere? Because authoritarian states and democracies think about information security in exactly the opposite way. Right? You and I, we defend freedom of speech. We think information is a good thing. We want the free flow of information, and we want governments to be able to enable that. Whereas, of course, authoritarian systems are afraid of information. They want to control the information that their people have access to. They want to control the data that enters their country and that leaves their country. And so for them, information is all about security. And so we start with very different assumptions, which has made it largely impossible to find common ground on how we should actually govern cyberspace. So if you don't have common ground and a common agreement, but you know that you're living in a very dangerous world where your adversaries on a daily basis are engaging in very dangerous behavior in cyberspace, That is to say, behavior that falls just under Article 5, NATO, so the collective defense provisions, but that really push not just propaganda, but sabotage, subversion to the limits of what might constitute perhaps or what might entail a kinetic response by countries, in particular members of the alliance or so. You want to kind of calm the waters in that cyberspace because you don't want to have that incalculable risk among members of the alliance, or particularly the United States and some of its adversaries, that could quickly get out of hand, where, for instance, imagine a substantial Russian or Chinese attack on critical US infrastructure that causes significant harm to the US. The US might decide to respond in a kinetic fashion, and in that case, we all lose. Think back to peacekeeping, 1950s. We didn't come up with peacekeeping as Canada to make the world a better place. We came up with it because we wanted to avert conflict, in particular nuclear conflict, between the superpowers, because we know we were all going to lose if it was going to get there. And so what Canada can do in this space is to collaborate with key other middle powers that have significant cyber capabilities and capacities to push back against our adversaries, to draw these clear red lines when it comes to our collective interests, our sovereignty, our multilateral institutions, prosperity, and saying these are red lines. And if you cross those lines, you can expect a coordinated response from a host of countries, likely in the cyber domain, but perhaps also in terms of sanctions or other types of diplomatic types of activity. And we can't do that on our own because we simply don't have the capacity to push back. But if we coordinate with a host of other countries, then we actually have the ability to deter this type of behavior and the type of aggression, because what you're seeing in Ukraine by Russia is nothing compared to the way, for instance, Russia behaves when it comes to the cyber domain. But the Americans, of course, we can say, sure, the US should just do that. But the Americans are busy with their own interests. And so the Americans would be quite happy if some smaller but important partners such as Canada and key middle power allies got together and took some of the responsibilities into their own hand when it comes to asserting their own interests and when it comes to asserting the rules-based international order in the cyber domain.
Right. Now, you mentioned a little bit earlier about asymmetry, and you also alluded to it earlier when we talk about free flow of information. I'm wondering if that makes the battle harder for those of us in the Western Alliance, and that we're societies that like free flow of information. We think these things are important. So are we facing an uphill battle when we're dealing with regimes where they can come in and with relatively little effort disrupt our systems and our discourse, but it's hard for us to push back and play offense, as you put it, in places where they control information as a matter of fact on a daily basis.
Look, that's a terrific observation on a host of fronts. So one of the reasons why Russia is so effective in this domain is because essentially there is not much of a private sector marketplace, right? So in Canada, in the US, and in our key allies and partner countries, there's a vast marketplace for this type of talent. So it's hard to recruit that talent to go work for defense or intelligence agencies when they can make twice or more that amount of money simply going into the private sector space in Russia. But also, interesting enough, as a result of the economic slowdown in China, increasingly individuals have to go work either for the state or for companies that are essentially doing the state's bidding, to which the state is outsourcing its particular effects or particular operations that it is looking to achieve. It does so because it's efficient and economical for them, but it also gives the state some arm's length to say, well, we didn't do this. Some actors sort of in our private marketplace do that, and we don't control them, even though, of course, they do. If you look at China, the Communist Party structure in Chinese corporations. So this has been one of the dimensions of why authoritarian states have are able to bring to bear sort of disproportionate firepower in the cyber domain, and one of the elements of the asymmetry. But you're also indeed absolutely correct that the relative freedom of our information domain and our information sphere is what they're able to exploit. Let me explain this sort of very concretely. The tools that are available to our agencies, to their agencies, are more or less the same tools. Okay, so China and Russia have the capability to build some extremely high-end tools, so does the United States, to a less extent Canada, but by and large, the commercially available tools that are about 98, 99% of the operations that we see and the exploits that we see are available to the same are all available to the same actors, state-based actors, non-state-based actors. The difference is how we use and deploy these tools. You will have seen, for instance, the Privacy Commissioner just very recently raised concerns about the way the RCMP deploys some of these tools. We've previously seen concerns by the federal court about even just the way, for instance, CSIS, our Security Intelligence Service, retains data. And we have significant capacities for review mechanisms, and we impose legislative constraints on our agencies, which is what we would expect in a democracy, especially in a constitutional democracy. We're premised on the rule of law. The people decide what the rules are and what the rules are that the agencies need to follow. But that, of course, means the game is a little bit more challenging for our agencies, because the means, when you Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, those justify the ends. So everything is good to go, even if those means are extremely high risk in terms of the response that they might provoke. Whereas in democracies, the means don't justify the ends. And we ask questions about, is this proportionate? Is it efficient? Is it going to be effective? We tell agencies when it comes to some operations domestically, for instance, that they need to get warrants when it comes to operations abroad. We've changed the Communication Security Establishment Act to give it powers in terms of active operations and offensive operations. But it turns out that it's relatively difficult to use those, because both the Minister of National Defense and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of National Defense has to sign off on them, but they have to coordinate with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because those operations can have political consequences for Canada. And it turns out that ministers have been very reticent to use the powers that we have in place. And I think one of the reasons they're reticent is because we don't have an appropriate doctrine. We haven't appropriately identified what the interests are that we're actually looking to defend and assert. We haven't appropriately figured out how do we coordinate with our allies in order to draw red lines in the sand. All of these issues that our adversaries don't need to worry about, because they're simply happy to exploit whatever vulnerabilities they can find to assert their interests.
Yeah, it turns out living in a democracy has some trade-off after all. I thought, Christian, maybe we could sort of wrap it up by sort of looking forward, if you can. Where do you see any prospect, with this government or future government, of taking this issue more seriously, of it being moved up the sort of priority list in terms of changes to come?
It's hard. I think this is a domain that's hard for politicians and for much of the public to wrap their head around. They don't see the immediate physical effects. It's a difficult domain, I think, to understand. The technology is hard to understand. It's not something that's going to give you much electoral payoff, so probably not where politicians are going to focus their efforts. At the same time, it is probably the single most important element of the 21st century, because data has now for a decade been more valuable than gold. Look at the top-ranked companies on the stock exchange. Yep. Look at the companies that have been driving much of the productivity growth of the last 25 years. Look at the importance of connectivity in terms of the ability for us all to operate, whether it's in our private lives or whether when it comes to generating our prosperity. And look at the amount of the GDP that is now generated by elements related to data, to infrastructure, to digital infrastructure, to networks, and the like. At the same time, of course, the information domain is arguably the single most important domain of statecraft in the 21st century. We used to think about, is it military? Is it economic power? Is it diplomatic power? If you're thinking about this from a traditional middle power perspective, such as Canada. But I think the single most important instrument of statecraft in the 21st century is the information domain. And that means ultimately the cyber domain. And what control you have in that domain, what intelligence you can bring to bear, what capabilities and capacities you have, and what effects you can achieve is ultimately going to determine what role you play in the 21st century international system. And in that system, Canada needs to ask itself the question, is it going to be exit, voice, or loyalty? That is to say, when the international system changes and changes rapidly, countries have three options. they can simply decide to bow out. We're just not going to be a middle power anymore. We're going to leave it up to other people to shape the world. Canada learned hard lessons in the first half of the 20th century about that approach by itself and by other countries. And we decided in the second half of the 20th century, we're going to invest in shaping that world because that's still going to be better for us in terms of political stability, economic prosperity, social harmony, than if we leave this problem up to other people. And so we shaped that terrain. Arguably, that made North America the most prosperous and desirable continent in the world. It didn't come by accident. It came as a deliberate strategy in which Canada invested significantly. And so we need to ask ourselves whether in the cyber domain, if that is the most important instrument of statecraft in the 21st century, is Canada prepared to do likewise? So are we just going to exit and leave this as to other people to shape that terrain? Is it going to be loyalty where we're going to be with our allies? We're going to make lots of performative announcements about the cyber domain and about defense, but then really all we're going to do is kind of follow in their path, which really means that we're not making the investments, we're not making the strategic decisions, we're not actually writing the doctrine, we're not restructuring our armed forces and intelligence services, and we're not enabling and posturing them in the way that we would if we were going to be serious about working with our allies? Or is it going to be voice? Are we going to be making a decision as a country, hopefully a multi-partisan decision as a country, that this is a domain that is absolutely critical to the 21st century, where Canada wants to be a key player? What we know based on the Harvard Belfer Cyber Power Index, Canada used to be in the top 10 countries in the world. What is it going to take that we're going to remain in those top 10 countries? We're going to get ourselves out of that downward trend, and we're going to be a country that's going to be a player and a game maker rather than simply a follower.
Well, Christian, you make a compelling case, and if we can't trust our politicians to take up the torch, I'm certainly glad we have folks like yourself making the case on their behalf. Again, the piece is co-authored with Joseph Seisman, and it's Coalition Strategic Cyber Campaigns, Functional Engagement as Cyber Doctrine for Middle Power Statecraft by Christian Leuprecht. Christian, thank you so much again for joining us, and thank all of you for tuning in.
Aaron, always terrific conversations with you. Thanks so very much.